Welcome back to Smart Talk. Our guest on this Veterans Day, retired Army Colonel Jeffrey McCausland, co-author of the book Battle-Tested: Gettysburg Leadership Lessons for 21st Century Leaders. He's also a visiting professor of international security at Dickinson College, the founder and CEO of Diamond Six Leadership and Strategy, and former dean of the U.S. Army War College. If you have a question or comment, 1-800-729-7532. Send an email to smarttalk@witf.org. On Twitter, we are at Smart Talk WITF. You not only talk about or write about the military commanders, but also Abraham Lincoln. We're going to get into Lincoln a little bit later in our discussion. But let's start with some of those military leaders. Robert E. Lee was commanding general of the Army of Northern Virginia for the Confederate Army. And General George Meade was the commander of the Army of the Potomac, the commanding generals at Gettysburg. What kind of leaders were they?
Well, they were very different leaders, and they were in very different places in their leadership at that particular moment. I mean, Robert E. Lee was a very well-known military officer even prior to the Civil War, well-known throughout the Federal Army, had been superintendent at West Point, had been widely described for his exploits during the Mexican War. As the Civil War begins, of course, he is offered command of the federal armies by then General Winfield Scott, who was sort of the chief of staff of the Army back in those days. Then Lee turned that down to go south and fight for his home state, the state of Virginia. He'll have been in command of the Army of Northern Virginia by the time we come to Gettysburg, about 18 months. And he's been very, very successful. He has won every battle except for Antietam. You might call that a draw. And in May of 1863, of course, he nearly destroys the Federal Army at the Battle of Chancellorsville. And in the aftermath of that, of course, there was a major strategic meeting of the military and political leadership of the Confederacy in Richmond to decide what to do next. And it's Lee's urging that they invade the North, that they invade Pennsylvania to seek a decisive battle on Union territory that he thinks might tip the war, which persuades the Confederate leadership to do that option. And there were other options that we could discuss if you wish. So he begins doing that with that regard. But he then, in many ways, is an icon to the people in his particular organization. He has been so successful. He is, by age, somewhat older than the commanders who are his immediate subordinates. And many of them had been younger officers when he was a senior officer in the Federal Army, or in some cases, had even been cadets at West Point when he was superintendent. Jeb Stuart, for example, had been a cadet and knew Robert E. Lee when he was superintendent. So he's an icon. On the other side of the coin, there's George Gordon Meade. Meade has only been in command of the Union Army on 1 July 1863 for a grand total of 3 days. On the 28th of June, a rider will show up at his tent with a message. Meade, who was a corps commander at the time, thought in his diary, he supposedly wrote down, "I thought I was going to be arrested." The rider would say, "No, sir, it's worse than that. You're not being arrested. You're actually being promoted and being made commander of the federal armies as they're trying to catch Robert E. Lee heading north." His predecessor, so-called General Fighting Joe Hooker, had been relieved or had resigned, and there's arguments about that, by Abraham Lincoln just prior to the battle. So now Meade takes over. Now Meade is commanding his peer group. Several of the guys who are corps commanders, and there are 7 corps commanders in the Union Army, by their date of rank actually outrank Meade. So he's in a much more difficult position. So Robert E. Lee, you have at Gettysburg, the icon, and George Gordon Meade, you have the guy leading his peer group in very different positions, both very experienced. Meade had been a federal officer in the Army prior to the Civil War, but both in very different positions.
So let me just follow up on that. So Lee as an icon, does that mean that those who are under him don't question his decisions maybe as much as what they would someone else that they were a peer with? And then with Meade, because he was closer in age and was a new commander, that he had to prove his leadership skills.
Well, I think that's exactly right. I mean, if you look at the immediate subordinates to Robert E. Lee, and he has 3 corps commanders plus Jeb Stuart, he has Richard Ewell and Ambrose Powell Hill, who have just been promoted from being divisional commanders to being corps commanders. which is an exponential leap in their leadership responsibilities. I would argue moving from organizational or operational leadership to strategic leadership positions. He has Jeb Stuart, and as they're moving north, of course, Jeb Stuart will go off on this long-term raid, and for about a week to 10 days, as they're moving into enemy country, Robert E. Lee has no idea where Stuart is, and is consequently deprived of an awful lot of intelligence. So even though he was very close to Stuart, Stuart actually in many ways was a mentee. Stuart is hardly a guy in that environment who's going to tell the boss what the boss doesn't want to hear. And then there's Peter Longstreet, who Lee would refer to as his old warhorse, who is his most trusted lieutenant. And throughout the battle on the 2nd and 3rd of July, they will disagree a great deal about what the Confederate Army should do. Longstreet urges, for example, at the end of the first day of the battle, that they should move to the south, outmaneuver the Confederate Army, and move towards Washington, find a good position, and have the Federal Army attack them. Lee says, no, we're going to stay here and attack them tomorrow. Longstreet will protest prior to Pickett's charge that this is that there are no 15,000 men arrayed for battle. Those are his words, can take that position. Lee insists that he, in fact, does that. So they're in very different position with their subordinates. On the other hand, George Gordon Meade, of course, arrives late on the first day. He's not really present on the first day. He moves forces around the second day to fend off Confederate attacks. But on the evening of the second day, in a small house on Cemetery Ridge, I should say, not far from where his statue stands today, he'll have a meeting of all his corps commanders to decide what they do on the third day, the fateful day of the Battle of Gettysburg. And as the meeting drags on, he will call for a vote, or his chief of staff calls for a vote on whether the Federal Army should stay at Gettysburg and defend, should attack the Confederates, or should in fact retreat. And they take a vote in inverse order of their seniority, so each officer is not in any way, convinced by a more senior position, a senior officer of their position, and they determine to defend. So very different techniques, whereas the evening of the second day, after 2 days of fighting, Robert E. Lee doesn't talk to any of his subordinates in great detail, keeps his own counsel until the next morning, when he will ride down the morning of the 3rd of July, find Peter Longstreet, and give him his direct instructions, which eventually is Pickett's charge on the afternoon of the 3rd of July, 1863.
Colonel McCausland, I'm going to talk about some of the leaders at Gettysburg. Union General John Buford, he basically chose where the battle would be fought on the first day. And as you do in every chapter, you point out that there's a special section in each chapter of what leadership skills each of the commanders or each of the military leaders showed. What leadership qualities did Buford show?
Well, Buford showed enormous initiative, and I would call leading the boss. I talk about people lead from where they are, and a leader wants to create a climate whereby he or she can be led. It doesn't do any good if you're the captain of a ship, if somebody comes up to you and says, hey, Captain, by the way, we're 6 inches from an iceberg. That's not very useful. 6 miles from the iceberg, that's useful. And of course, John Buford will be the guy, as you suggest, Scott, who will arrive on the afternoon of the 30th of June, 1863, will survey the situation very quickly. He can see Confederate elements off in the distance west of the town, out towards Cashtown, and he looks at the terrain and determines the key terrain being Cemetery Ridge and the Round Tops and Culp's Hill that have to be preserved. So he makes that decision to deploy his forces along McPherson's Ridge, just the west of town, which allows him then to trade space for time. He knows his small cavalry force cannot hold off against an expected advancement by Confederate infantry in large numbers the next morning, but he can trade space for time, fight on McPherson's Ridge, fall back to Seminary Ridge, and if necessary, fall back to Cemetery Ridge. But he sends a message to John Reynolds, a Pennsylvanian, oh, by the way, who is the commander of the left wing of the Union Army, who is advancing quickly towards Gettysburg, and basically says to him the following: we've seen the Confederates west of Gettysburg. I believe they're here in strength. Get the infantry up here first thing in the morning. Now, at that particular moment, as a leader, Reynolds could have done a couple things. He could have appointed a committee to study the problem. He could have called Buford back, let's have a consultation. But no, these two guys trusted each other. Reynolds trusted his subordinate. If John Buford says that's what we should do, that's what we're going to do. and Reynolds would accelerate his movement towards Gettysburg for the infantry, who will arrive about midday on the 1st of July.
But you also use Reynolds as an example of a type of leader. General Reynolds, as you mentioned, a Pennsylvanian, he was from Lancaster. He was offered the command of the Army of the Potomac, but turned it down because he didn't want Washington interfering. Reynolds was killed in the first hours of the battle, and probably, when you read your book, should not have been in the place he was or doing what he was doing when he was killed. You use that as an example of another type of leader.
Yeah, exactly right, Scott. But it's really more of a choice. I really want people more to think about what Reynolds was doing, because in the 21st century, I think at times we discount one of the most important things a leader has to think about when his or her organization is in a crisis, and that is their physical presence. Where do they go and who do they talk to? Because we can think, well, we got this marvelous technology. I'm talking to you right now through Zoom, or we could email or fax or text or whatever. But still, human beings, I think, interact, particularly during crisis, in that direct relationship. And so that really is the question: where should Reynolds be? And when he's killed, you're right, he's killed there at Herbst Woods. There's a monument to where he was killed on the spot. He is basically commanding about 300 soldiers in a Wisconsin regiment, plugging the line, saying, "Forward, men, forward, for God's sake, drive those people out of those trees." And he is the only man on horseback in a field full of soldiers on foot. Doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that's an officer. And obviously that's what a Confederate marksman did when he shoots John Reynolds, and Reynolds is shot through the head and is dead, most people believe, before he even hits the ground. But he's commanding those 300 guys when also he has overall command of 20,000, the entire left wing, 3 corps of the Union Army. And so the question is, as a leader and your organization is a crisis, where should I be? Some people would interpret what Reynolds would do as micromanagement. I find young people often do that. Other people would say, well, that was a critical moment, an absolutely existential moment for the organization, and that's where he would be. Others say, no, at that moment, he needs to be the guy maintaining the big picture, maintaining the large view of the organization, and take actions in that vein and empower others. So it's really more to get people to think about that particular choice, and how, even though we have all this technology, the presence of the leader is crucially important, particularly when the organization is under stress.
But that Reynolds, and I have to admit, in all the times I've studied the Battle of Gettysburg, I've never heard Reynolds described as a micromanager.
Yeah, but you could certainly suggest that. And I do that, again, to make people think, because this book is to make people think about leadership. And the discussions I've had break down, just as you and I are breaking it down, exactly this way. That particular Wisconsin regiment had a very capable commander who would, by the way, lose a leg in the battle, would survive and go back to a distinguished career back in his home state of Wisconsin once the war is over. So Reynolds could have just said, hey, Colonel, get your unit in there. But depending on you, plug that particular hole while I maintain this larger view of what's going on and keep all of it, make sure we're not outflanked, maneuver other large forces. But no, he moves right in to make those direct orders to individual soldiers. Obviously, does one recognize and admire his bravery? No question about it. But of course, for the organization, it meant they lost their most senior leader at a crucial moment in this particular crisis.
Who are some of the other skilled leaders in this battle on both sides?
Well, a couple guys that I admire a great deal that you don't hear much about are two. One is a guy named Gouverneur Warren, and one is a guy named Strong Vincent. Gouverneur Warren is an engineer, advisor to General Meade. He is a staff officer. Therefore, he only has command over his horse and a couple lieutenants. But he is sent up on Little Round Top by General Meade on the afternoon of the 2nd of July to determine, is there anybody up there? He gets up there and finds there's only a signal detachment up there, and realizes this particular piece of terrain really anchors the southern end of the Union line. And of course, Peter Longstreet is conducting a massive assault through the wheat field and peach orchard, and is basically crushing the Union 3rd Corps and advancing close to Little Round Top. So he sends a message out to try to get one of the Union commanders who are rushing to reinforce the 3rd Corps there in the peach orchard to divert part of their forces to Little Round Top. That message is intercepted by another Pennsylvanian, oh, by the way, a lawyer from Erie, Pennsylvania, by the name of Strong Vincent, whose orders are to go to the wheat field and reinforce General Sickles in the Third Corps. Now, he can ignore Warren. Warren has no command authority over him whatsoever, but they knew each other. They had a personal relationship, and Vincent realizes, A, if Warren thinks this is a good idea, it's probably a good idea, and his quick assessment of the situation suggests by the train it's a good idea. So he violates his orders, showing enormous initiative, and moves his brigade, which includes, oh, by the way, the 20th Maine and Joshua Chamberlain, up on Little Round Top, where they defend and hold that very crucial piece of terrain. You don't hear about Strong Vincent because in the defense of Little Round Top, he is in fact killed in the fighting and is therefore largely not heard of, though there is, I understand, a high school in Erie, Pennsylvania called Strong Vincent High School. But if Vincent hadn't made that decision as a junior leader and shown that initiative, we would have lost at Gettysburg.
And of course, Chamberlain, I don't know. He's taken on legendary status since the movie Gettysburg came out in the early 1990s, when men were outnumbered and were out of ammunition, and he decided to tell them to fix bayonets and charge down the hill. But you also use Chamberlain as an example of great leadership. But I want to go on to another leader here. You mentioned the Peach Orchard. General Dan Sickles. He moved further forward than he was ordered to, exposing a Union flank. And you were talking about Longstreet. Is that an example of poor leadership at Gettysburg?
I would say so, because if you look at it from the military standpoint, what in fact Sickles does is by advancing forward, he creates a bulge in the Union line. So he can be attacked on three directions at any given moment, number one. Number two, he creates a gap between the northern end of the Third Corps, his unit, which is at the very end of the Union line, and the unit that is just north of him. So there's a gap that the Confederates could exploit. And of course, the Third Corps just gets crushed in the process in terms of massive casualties in the wheat field and the peach orchard. But you could say Dan Sickles does one thing well, which Strong Vincent didn't. And even though he loses a leg at Gettysburg, he survives the battle, is carried off the field, smoking a cigar with his leg strapped to the stretcher, and goes back and will write up about his exploits, identifying himself as a hero, will eventually be awarded the Medal of Honor, and will go on to a distinguished, though somewhat controversial, career in the United States Congress.
And charged with murdering his wife's lover, and just a whole lot of other things. He's a colorful figure, that's for sure. You're listening to Smart Talk on WITF, your home for NPR News and all things regional. I'm Scott LaMar.